You know, we've all heard those absolute nightmare stories about homeowner associations. But what happens when that fight spills into a courtroom and the association pulls a legal move that nobody, and I mean nobody, saw coming? Well, today we're diving into the story of one homeowner's battle against his board, and it's a huge lesson in what it really takes to win a legal fight. So at the very heart of this whole thing is a homeowner named Haining Xia. And for him, this wasn't just some disagreement over bylaws. No. He saw this as a moral crusade. In his own words, he was fighting evil and looking for justice. And you gotta remember that powerful emotional framing because it's the key to understanding everything that happens next. All right, so let's start at the very beginning, the complaint itself. This is where it all kicked off. So the date is September 21st, 2020. Haining Xia goes ahead and files a formal petition against the Dorsey Place Condominium Association. Now, on the surface, this might just look like a standard dispute, but the specifics of his complaint, well, they raise some really serious questions. See, Mr. Xia's complaint was really specific. He wasn't just generally unhappy. He was pointing to multiple bylaw violations. But the real bombshell, the core accusation, was this. The board allegedly hadn't held proper elections for 2 years straight. Now think about that. If that was true, was the board even legitimate to begin with? So that brings us to the next part of this story, the association's defense. And this is where things take a really, really unexpected turn. I mean, if you're accused of not holding elections, you'd probably expect a defense about, well, elections. But what the association came back with was something else entirely. So how did they respond? Did they show proof of elections? Needing minutes, ballots, anything like that? Nope, they did none of that. Instead, they took a pretty radical approach. Their argument was, frankly, stunning. They claimed the court had no power over them, no jurisdiction, because they weren't even a condominium association anymore. Their defense was basically, hey, you can't sue us for breaking the club's rules because we already disbanded the club. And here's the kicker, the proof they brought to the table. The association produced a document, a condominium termination agreement that was officially recorded way back on April 9th, 2019. Now look at that timeline. That's more than a year before Mr. Xia ever filed his complaint. Their point was devastatingly simple. He was suing an entity that, legally speaking, didn't exist in that form anymore. So, you might think that's game over, right? Well, not quite. Even with this bombshell defense, the first ruling wasn't the end of the road. The fight was going to continue. Initially, the judge actually sided with the association. The case was thrown out, dismissed. And the reason why is so critical for anyone who ever finds themselves in a legal dispute. The judge said that Mr. Xia had made some very strong claims, assertions, but he hadn't provided any real evidence to back them up. And in a courtroom, just saying something is true is never enough. But you've got to give it to him. Mr. Xia was persistent. His case gets dismissed in January, but by February, he's already requesting a rehearing. And then in March, he actually gets it. He was granted a rare second chance to present the hard evidence that the judge said was missing the first time. Okay, so this second hearing is where the entire messy dispute gets boiled down to one single, fundamental legal idea. It's a concept that really underpins almost every single civil case that goes to court. And that concept is the burden of proof. This is so important. See, it wasn't the association's job to prove they were innocent. Not at all. It was Mr. Xia's job, as the person making the accusation, to prove that they were guilty. The entire burden was on his shoulders. And the specific legal bar he had to clear is called preponderance of the evidence. Now, that sounds all formal and complicated, but it's not like what you see in the crime dramas, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. It actually means he just had to convince the judge that it was more probable than not that his claims were true. Think of it like this. Picture a set of legal scales. All he had to do was tip those scales of justice, even just slightly, past that 50% mark in the judge's mind. He just had to make his version of the story seem a little more likely than the other side's. That's it. And that brings us to the final act, the judge's ruling. With that legal standard set, everything came down to that final rehearing. This was his last chance to make his case. So at the final hearing, Mr. Xia did submit some documents. But, and this turned out to be the fatal misstep, he didn't explain what they meant. He didn't connect the dots for the judge. See, just handing over a stack of papers isn't proof. You have to explain how those papers prove your case. And this right here is the fundamental disconnect in this whole story. The petitioner's approach was all about assertions and powerful emotions, about fighting evil. But the legal requirement was about evidence and proof. He was fighting a moral battle, but he was in a legal arena that only cared about one thing. Could he prove the association violated its bylaws? And so, the final verdict finally came down on July 14th, 2021. The judge's conclusion was clear. For a second time, the petitioner had failed to meet his burden of proof. The case was dismissed, and this time it was for good. The association was legally declared the winner. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? In a legal fight, is passion enough to win? Haining Xia certainly had passion, and this deep, powerful conviction that he was right. But this case is such a stark reminder that the legal system, it doesn't run on passion. It runs on proof. And without that proof, even the most righteous crusade can ultimately fail.